So we're in your U.S. history book in Chapter 5, Section 1, Conflict with Great Britain. And this will lead on to the War of Independence. And here you see some pictures there. Picture of the Boston Tea Party, so-called the Boston Tea Party, onto the Revolution. And we'll see going on to the Minutemen, picture of the Minutemen in the bottom picture. So let's begin. Okay, there were new trade policies. Since the colonists now were enjoying greater prosperity and freedom, and in 1750, there were many native-born in America, to the second and third generations now. And before 1700, Britain just had a laissez-faire, hands-off policy, basically letting the colonists just prosper as they would, And this would also leave the colonies to govern themselves and protect themselves and provide for themselves, which they did. Then in the 18th century, Britain had risen from this weak nation to this world empire. So now Britain was had colonies all over the world. In fact, it said that the sun never sets on the empire of Great Britain, right? And so here we have a powerful Great Britain, and we have an America that is prospering. So Britain controlled, as you see in the picture, Ireland, Scotland, India, parts of Africa, North America, and the West Indies. That's a lot of colonies. America had risen from this insignificant outpost position, as just the wilderness, to profitable colonies. The colonies were prospering. So England thought, okay, now we need strict regulation, and this would be necessary for a prospering America. So let's see what happens then. The mercantile theory of economics. We have to stop there and talk about this, because this was the belief that the real measure of nations' wealth was in how much gold and silver they had. The colonies existed solely for the good of the mother country for wealth and maintaining the balance of trade. Exports were more than imports then, and they received their difference in gold and silver. Basically, see the picture of gold and silver and foodstuffs and raw materials all given to the mother country. So England thought America exists for our benefit, for the mother country's benefit. That's the mercantile. Navigation Acts also happened, and they started in 1651. And so, first of all, was the Navigation Act of 1660, where all goods imported or exported from the colonies had to be carried on ships, but the ships had to be owned by Great Britain. In fact, 3/4 of the crew must be British. And certain products could not even be sold directly to foreign countries. They'd have to be sold to Great Britain. So Great Britain held a lucrative position as a middleman for foreign trade. So the Navigation Act of 1663 was even stricter. It had a further restriction on colonial trade. All trade must be channeled through Great Britain. This gave the British a monopoly on the colonial imports. So things from America. So now we have these Navigation Acts. You see at the bottom there, Navigation Acts of 1660, Navigation of 63, 1673, and 1696. So you see these navigations. Certain products, the cartoon up here, let's kind of see here. Certain products can only be sold to England or English colonies, such as sugar, tobacco, and indigo. And goods from other countries had to go to Europe first, and goods had to be transported on English ships. And basically, England was saying, we need to tighten our leash a bit more on America. Oh, how do you think Americans are going to think about this? So, the Molasses Act of 1733 was gave further strict control. It taxed sugar, rum, and molasses that were imported from the West Indies. and it protected the British merchants in the West Indies. So the colonists generally ignored and smuggled products in anyway, but there would be later a stricter control in this, and basically the ships would begin being searched. We'll see that later on. So you can see Molasses Act of 1730. Many New Englanders made a living by turning molasses and sugar into rum. And so the Molasses Act helped the sugar plantation owners on the islands of the British West Indies. And so a tax was placed on sugar and molasses that came from the islands. But it got worse. So you see the Molasses Act of 1733. You could see the high price for them. So Americans paid a high price for molasses and sugar and, of course, rum. Then came in more. The Woolens Act goes further. Woolens Act, the Hat Act, the Iron Act, the Lumber Act. There'd be taxes on all of these products. The colonial industry expanded, so the British manufacturers demanded protection by the Parliament. So more acts were then made to control and regulate the colonists in America. Even the lumber industry, where the English marked trees in America for them to be made specifically for ships for the Royal Navy. And the Board of Trade in Britain basically showed that they only cared for the mother country, not for America. They had the power to annul the laws passed by the colonies, controlling them, and power to not hear appeals from the colonies at all, and complete power to influence all trade policies. The British did give Americans a monopoly only on one product, and that would be tobacco. Otherwise, they controlled everything. And basically, the tax was put on many of these objects and different needs. We'll find it goes further than that. Increased political regulation. Britain's firm hand was in political affairs. All but 5 of the colonies were governed by royal governors. That means the governor was controlled by Great Britain, they weren't America, they were from Great Britain, the governors. And they sent new royal governors from Britain to the colonies to tighten up, to make sure that the colonies were doing as Great Britain and following the laws and taxes that they had set forth. And so you see the royal colonies. We have New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. 8 of the 13 were now called royal colonies. And the king was named as governor, as the chief executive of the colony, but actually appointed a governor. He appointed an advisory board for the royal governor that was sent there. And then, so we can see how the royal colony was set up with the king and the royal governor. So, and then we have the effects of the French and Indian War. In 1763, there was a turning point the way Americans thought of England. There'd be a decade of dissension would ultimately lead to the War for Independence, because the results of the French and Indian War showed some things about England. Americans gained valuable experience in defending themselves at that time, and they experienced military leaders in the French Indies, such as George Washington. He was a military leader in the French and Indian War. As you recall, the French and Indian War was France and the Native Americans attacking against the colonists in Great Britain. But the colonists had to defend themselves in these situations. And the colonists were led to be dependent on Britain for their protection, but yet alone they knew that they could protect themselves and they actually needed to. The British defense was a problem because many native tribes became hostile, but Britain really didn't send in help to defend the colonists against the Native Americans there. So they were basically fearing the loss of their land and being cheated, as we know. the Indians were. So they had this constant problem going on, and Britain failed to be the middleman for the colonists and the American Indians. Pontiac's conspiracy. So Pontiac in 1720 to 1769 led a conspiracy that cost many lives in America. It would take thousands of British troops to protect the colonies, and Britain had a defense problem indeed. It could not send all these soldiers over to protect the colonists. Britain faced financial problems due to the war conflicts with France, so they didn't want to spend the money as sending troops to protect the colonists against Native American conspiracies against them. So to maintain troops in the colonies would increase the debt. And so Great Britain believed the colonists' taxes should be raised to cover all of these obligations, since they would have to send more troops to America to protect them, that the taxes must be higher. And this put more demands on the colonists, of course. You see there, Pontiac's War. The writ of assistance, search warrants. Now this kind of was topping it off, let's just say, to what was going on between Great Britain and America. So to help authorities enforce trade laws in the colonies, search warrants gave the right for the British to search any place or any time or any ship for any smuggled goods, right? And the colonists saw this as an invasion of privacy, that Great Britain just could come in and search whatever they wanted. And these writs, writs of assistance, such were called, the king angered the colonists again by enacting these. This allowed general search warrants, which let them search any time, as we see that picture there. It says, hey, what's it say? Hey, thought a man's home was his castle. No, British could come in and search your home anytime they wanted. Parsons Cause in 1750. So this is the first time I heard of this episode. It's quite a deal. So there was a dispute over Britain's right to legislate laws in the colony. The British thought they could come in and make laws in the colonies as they saw fit. And Virginia paid taxes to support Anglican or English ministers. So these Anglican ministers were coming in. They were from England, and the Virginia had to pay them money, tax money. Well, the payments were made in tobacco, but the tobacco price went up. So then when the tobacco price went up, they were making excessive amount of money, salaries, as being taxed from the Virginians. So the House of Burgess lowered their tax and said, no, we can't pay you that much now, since the tobacco's worth so much more money. Okay, that was the dispute. So in 1759, the Anglican or English ministers appealed to the king to set aside the ruling of Virginia and say, we should be able to be paid whatever we want from the Americans. We are Anglican ministers. So the Anglican ministers sued for back pay, said the Americans need to pay us more money since they lowered the price since the tobacco price went, we should be paid a lot more. So these were Parsons. These were English ministers coming in that wanted to be paid by the Americans' taxes. Surely wouldn't happen today, huh? So that caused much turmoil in America, that England was coming in and setting laws in Virginia. So Patrick Henry, he defends in Virginia the House of Burgesses. So Patrick Henry, he lived 1736 to 1799. He was a young lawyer there, and he defended Virginia. Now, you're going to hear of Patrick Henry because you're going to hear his voice sound throughout the War for Independence later on. So he's a very, very famous patriot of America. So the Britain colonial legislature to pass the laws in America could pass the laws as they pleased. and the king had no right to arbitrarily set aside colonial law. So what he was saying, Patrick Hanun says, they have no right to come in and say that we as Americans, your laws are above our laws that we have set, and especially in this paying these Anglican pastors, what you want us to pay them. And so the court ruled against the House of Burgesses and ordered the back pay to the English clergymen. So these English pastors, these English Anglican pastors, I should say pastors or clergymen, I would call them, they got as much money as they wanted, and they were taxed by the people. But the jury, out of contempt, ruled something else. They said, okay, we'll pay back taxes, but we're just going to give them 1 penny. So you can see how they got mad. We're only getting 1 penny? We're only get 1 penny? As they looked at these pastors or so coming in from England, Anglican pastors, and thought, we should not have to pay them, so they had the discrepancy from the English point of view and the American point of view. And then, of course, we have a new king George III. And lived 1738 to 1820. There's a picture of him. And he was from the German Hanoverian line, a different line. So he was unfamiliar, really, of how to treat the American colonies. But he vowed to bring the American colonies into subjection. And so he appointed a new prime minister, George Grenville. And George Grenville lived 1712 to 1770. He would make it even harsher to be an American, and that way to tax America, not only tax America, but to give strong holds on Americans' freedoms. So he would help the king to do this, to bring American colonies into subjection, and to order to solve Britain's defense and financial problems, he would have to have a very rigid and harsh program of taxing. So basically, Grenville's Large, George Grenville, would tax Americans more and more and be very rigid and send those to make sure that they paid their taxes. Grenville's program. First of all, the proclamation of 1763 that he made, see him up there in the corner there. He set the boundary line of colonies would be the Appalachian Mountains. So he said the Americans the colonists could not go beyond the Appalachian Mountains because only Great Britain could buy the Native American land. They could only own this land beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Oh, that would be a problem. And the traders would require a British license for everything. If you were trading in America, you had to have a license, and you had to pay for a license from England. Number 2, the rigid enforcement of the trade laws. So more British ships had to come to control and patrol American coastal waters. More British ships, so that make sure the American the ships were not smuggling, to stop any smuggling, and the royal governors had to assist them to make sure that the British ships had free reign and that the American ships could not smuggle in items. The Sugar Act of 1764 cut in half the tax on raw sugar that was imported to the colonies, but raised the tax on refined sugar. So the Sugar Act, he got more taxation on sugar. And then on to the Currency Act of 1764. And this barred colonial or American government from issuing paper money. So basically saying America cannot issue its own money in any way. And they must pay British merchants in colonial currency, basically saying that the colonial government couldn't issue paper money anymore, and they had to pay in the currency that the British enacted them to. So basically saying, nope, You had to have the British money. Grenville added more to this, the Stamp Act of 1765, that colonists must buy stamps or seals affixed to any legal document, pamphlet, or newspaper. So if you had a newspaper, if you had a pamphlet, if you had a legal document of marriage or baptism, you would have to put a stamp on it. It'd have to be stamped. And this stamp you would have to pay for from England. So every legal document had to come through England and be stamped, and you'd have to pay a tax on that, the Stamp Act. This was the worst, because you can imagine, you couldn't get married, you couldn't get baptized, you couldn't get, you couldn't have any legal document, at all, without, or a pamphlet or even a newspaper without having these stamps on them. And you had to buy these from the government agents from Britain. And if anyone avoided this act, they would be tried without a jury, and but they'd be tried by royal appointed judges from England. And so that was serious. So, of course, this taxation was getting really, really a problem in America, especially the Stamp Act. The Quartering Act of 1765 was another thing. It required colonists to furnish British troops with certain supplies and living quarters. So when the British troops came to America, they would have to have supplies from America, and they'd have to have a place to stay, and Americans would have to give it to them. So later on, this even got even stricter, where they could come right into American family's house, a colonist's house, and they would have to live right with the family, and the family would have to take care of these British soldiers. So these soldiers at first were housed in taverns, barns, sheds, and vacant buildings, but later they would be housed right in the midst of the colonists' houses. And they would have to be reimbursed for everything by the colony. The colony would have to pay for them. So we have the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, the Quartering Act, the Stamp Act. All these are going to actually cause problems between Great Britain and America, as you can see. The colonists' response to Grenville's program. So every part of it angered the colonists, especially the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. You can imagine. The Sugar Act blatantly would raise revenue targeted right on the Americans themselves. And the New York State legislature declared there should be no taxation without representation. Oh, that was important. So this would be the grand principle of every free state, that if you're going to tax us, then we should be represented in the Parliament of England, that we should have a say in our taxation. You just can't come and tax us whatever your wish would be, right? The Boston lawyer James Otis, who lived 1725 to 1783, well, Otis published The Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Proved. So he started publishing things so the people would look and say, oh, what is going on here? We're being taxed here and there, and so they know exactly. And so this became widely circulated, and most of the colonists could read, and as they read about it, they became even more angry. We have in the column, as Otis claimed, taxation without representation is a tyranny. The British financial minister Grenville disagreed, saying the colonists were subjects of Britain and enjoyed the protection of its laws, so we could tax them for whatever we wanted, he was saying. The response to the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was the most hated part of Grenville's program. It held the boldest protests of the Americans. In Virginia, Patrick Henry gave fiery speeches that made him famous at this time. You'll find he became one of the greatest patriots here. And basically, he said these things. He said, Caesar had Brutus, Charles I had Cromwell, George III may profit by their example. He was saying, okay, there's going to be problems. That's basically saying there's going to be problems. Cries of treason came from England. If this is treason, make the most of it, he said. The Virginia House has sole power for taxes, not Britain. So you can see the protests against the Stamp Act, especially no taxation without representation. Samuel Adams and John Adams in Massachusetts. That was Virginia. Now we're looking at Massachusetts. Samuel Adams, which actually we are descended from Samuel Adams, so famous patriot, and his cousin John Adams led protest. They insisted that the British Constitution gave the rights of property and representation based on God's absolute laws. No man could take these rights away. Only the colonial legislator could tax Massachusetts people. Parliament's taxes were in violation of the colony's royal charter. So basically looked at the royal charter and saw, no, that England cannot come in and tax us, and Massachusetts would stand up against what was being done and the freedoms that were being taken away in Massachusetts, headed by John Adams and Samuel Adams. John Adams would become the second president. The Sons of Liberty were established. In Boston, Samuel Adams organized the Sons of Liberty, and they gave protests and parades and forced stamp distributors to resign. Other patriots followed this, forming their own Sons of Liberty. So, the Sons of Liberty. Merchants in New York and Boston and others too put teeth into the Stamp Act protest. They agreed not to import British goods until the act was repealed, and this boycott hurt the British merchants. So the Sons of Liberty were there to say, no, we're not going to put up with all of this. The Stamp Act Congress. In June of 1765, Massachusetts colonies sent representatives to give a unified response to the Stamp Act. 9 colonies responded, calling themselves the Stamp Act Congress. It convened on October 7, 1765 in New York City in opposition to the tyrannical acts of the British Parliament. And then on October 19th, a resolution was sent to petition the king on the Stamp Act. The resolution to the king defended their rights as Englishmen. It restored their royal charters with representation and to restore the land grants given to the colonies. So these were important. They were telling the king. The parliamentary debate was long heated on the Stamp Act repeal, and they believed the colonists had virtual representation in the British Empire. They just thought, you already have representation. And the colonists rejected this, as did some members, including William Pitt the Elder. So there were some on the parliament that said, no, Americans, they have a point here. And so they were defending their rights as Englishmen and restoring their charters. They wanted their charters, their royal charters, to govern themselves. And they wanted land grants to be given to the colonies of their own land. Edmund Burke. And Edmund Burke, he lived 1729 to 1797, a very important man on the parliament who was an Irishman that stood up for American rights. He was one of Britain's greatest statesmen, and he defended the colonies. He said, colonies have become powerful political entities, and we must deal with them as distinct from Great Britain. In 1766, Parliament finally repealed the Stamp Act. But the same day, another act, the Declaratory Act, declared colonists were subordinate to Great Britain. That you are subordinate. Colonies cannot make their own laws, they said. And the Parliament had the power to pass laws to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever, which meant that trouble was far from over in America. Even though Edmund Burke tried to help the colonists in the midst of it, it would not come to pass. Yes, the War for Independence was on its way.